Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Kachijian, and today I'm joined by Phil White. Phil is an Emmy-nominated writer who frequently contributes to the Inertia, Stand-Up Paddleboard the Mag, and Canoe and Kayak. He is the co-author with Dr. Kelly Starrett of the forthcoming books Flight Plan and Waterman 2.0, and is also collaborating on Game Changer with University of Michigan football performance director Dr. Fergus Connolly, and Bridging the Gap with Sue Falsone, the first female athletic head trainer in Major League Sports. His other books include Whistle Stop, which Larry King said I can't put down, and Our Supreme Task, which the Times literary supplement called Illuminating. One of the major themes of this podcast is embracing uncertainty. We've talked a great deal about the degree to which certain things or certain phenomena can actually be quantified. That goes back to episodes with Andy Morgan, Russell Roberts, and Fergus Connolly most recently. And I wanted to speak to Phil White because he recently wrote a book called Unplugged, which is about our fixation with wearable technology as it pertains to the fitness industry, and kind of extrapolates on some similar themes that previous guests discussed, but in a little bit more depth, as Unplugged is entirely about our relationship with technology and what we should reasonably attempt to measure. So Phil and I discussed, first and foremost, what data is worthy of collection. And to do that, we have to basically start with a question. So when it comes to data, do we start with a question and then let that question dictate what data we're going to collect? Or do we collect a bunch of data to help inform the question? Phil has a very specific answer when it comes to that question. He also goes into great depth about the ethics of wearable technology, particularly with regard to privacy and security. This is an area that I haven't seen many people discuss, and Phil and his co-authors go into great depth in the book, and I think that the book is worth purchasing for this section alone. We also talk about technology law and regulation, or lack thereof, really. We talk about technology and communication etiquette. Technology has made us ever so reachable, and it's helped make us more connected with people, but that can come at a cost where there's never really any boundaries when it comes to communication. So Phil and I discuss what are some reasonable boundaries when it comes to this accessible world that we live in. We talk about virtual reality a little bit and what we can expect from that technology in the future, and close with some of Phil's upcoming projects. Phil's written extensively on a variety of topics. Fascinating person, so I really hope you enjoy some of his insight. So Phil, thanks so much for coming on to talk about Unplugged. I wanted to begin by asking you about how you, Andy, and Brian came to collaborate on the project. I think that Unplugged is somewhat revealing as a topic, but I think that if you talk about how the three of you came to write the book, it might also reveal some insight into what the book's about.
Sure. And so Brian and I got connected through our mutual friend, Dr. Kelly Starrett, who most people would know as founder of MobilityWOD.com, and for a long time did the mobility courses for CrossFit, and then obviously the New York Times bestselling author of Becoming a Supple Leopard, Desk-Bound, and Ready to Run. And Kelly and I actually got hooked up through Sup the Mag, which is of all things, the stand-up paddleboarding sister publication of Surfer Magazine and Canoe and Kayak. And a lot of people don't know that Kelly has as he puts it, a river rat background, where he was a national team member for whitewater canoeing back in the day and was a river guide for a while and lived out of his van with his dog for a couple of years doing that. And before he ended up in San Francisco. And so, yeah, that's kind of an untold part of his story. So initially I was trying to fix my buggered up back, which I had messed up deadlifting, through a non-pharmaceutical and non-surgical method and stumbled across him online. And so I just tried his methods and managed to get rid of the horrible nerve pain I was having through that injury, and really thought maybe it would help the readers if I got connected with him and gave them some of his top tips with regard to paddling. So we did a couple of pieces together for the mag. He did a video, and then he just started plugging me in with people in his network, like Chris Frankel, the performance director at TRX, and Brian. And so Brian and I had probably kicked around the idea of doing a book together for about a year and a half or so. And we really both settled on this topic of fitness technology. And Brian is the great self-experimenter. And so he has a whole gear corner in his house just full of all these devices. You know, he was really early in experimenting with HRV. He also tries things when he rubbishes them initially, and when he thinks they're silly and they don't work. So a good example is the training mask. So a friend told him about it and gave it to him to use, and he thought initially, oh, this is just nonsense. You know, it makes you look like Bane from the Dark Knight trilogy. It looks silly. You know, there's no way this can work. And then he did a plank and did a couple of other exercises, both with and without the mask, and realized, well, actually, this is a pretty useful piece of kit here. And he completely changed his opinion of it, and it actually led him down this road, which has now led to some of the stuff he's been doing with Led Hamilton with XPT, and then also with his Art of Breath seminars, which him and Rob Wilson are putting on. And in the course of all this, he and Andy became friends a couple of years ago. And really, it's an interesting juxtaposition because Andy, which is Dr. Andy Galpin, our co-author, is a muscle physiologist at Cal State Fullerton. And also, he trains some mixed martial artists, some MMA fighters, some wrestlers. And so he also has that kind of practitioner background. So you have the scientist/practitioner on one side in Andy, and then you have the self-experimenter/human performance expert in Brian on the other end. And so we thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to try to bring those two perspectives together and have me kind of try to create a middle ground in the center. And that's what came out of it, is this book Unplugged, which the name might suggest is anti-fitness technology, but is really just saying, you know, rather than using tech as a crutch or a cure-all, that we should be doing a better job and be more intentional of using it to cue, inform, and calibrate, and really ask better questions, rather than just using it as this, you know, thing that we just assume is going to make us better all the way along. And so hopefully that's what we did in Unplugged.
No, you definitely did. And there's so many layers to the book, and we were talking offline a little bit about moderation. So I think that when it comes to the whole data acquisition and data monitoring phenomenon, it transcends fitness, right? I mean, this is everywhere where, like, you hear about the term big data, and we're just trying to almost quantify everything to try to solve some problems that were previously unanswerable. And so I think that, you know, with the data phenomenon, the real question is, all right, how do what's the middle ground? Because I think some people take a very, you know, anti-tech, antiquated position and say, well, we can't benefit from any of this technology. I'll just use my intuition. And then the flip side of that is, well, you know, technology is going to make everything better. There's no downside. The more things you can measure, the better. And I think, like anything else, the answer is probably somewhere in the middle. So I think the key question when we're talking about data, whether it's in the fitness world or anywhere else, is how do we go about answering what it actually is that we need to quantify, and then figuring out what's important to measure versus fixating on things that maybe don't really matter. So how do you guys go about answering that question?
Andy would answer it with two words. It depends. It completely depends upon your context, really. And so some people might think it's a bit strange that Tim Ferriss contributed to this book. He gave us kind of his top 10 tips on this, and we interviewed him while Brian was semi-unplugged, climbing a mountain in Oregon, as one does, you know, when you're interviewing Tim Ferriss. And so that's kind of a useless tidbit, but an interesting anecdote to some. Maybe I thought it was quite funny that Brian was on mute and getting 4,000 or 5,000 feet in vertical gain while I was kind of running this interview. And so Tim is kind of known as one of the leaders of the self-quantification movement, a quantified self, if you want to say it the other way. And so that's why we've had a few comments like, oh, it's weird that you would have Tim involved. But really, there are a lot of demands on his time, and he's very intentional with everything he does. And so his point with all of this is, what is the outcome that you were trying to achieve? And then figure that out, and then to start working backwards from there. What numbers, if you were able to change them, may get you closer to achieving that goal? That it may not be a direct correlation, but it might be something that might help you along the way. And then from there, how are you going to start going about affecting those numbers? And if you don't have the knowledge to do that, we suggest that you get a coach involved who might have the knowledge to do that. And then working backwards even further, what is the least technology that you can use and the smallest data set that you can use to start analyzing this numerical progress within, again, the qualitative context of whatever it is you're trying to achieve. And so one of Tim's little phrases in there is, use the least technology you think is necessary, not the most you think you can handle. And so really that it all starts again with the context, with the idea of it depends, and really, as Fergus Connolly, my co-author on Game Changer, would say, working backwards from game day. Like, what is your objective on game day? How does that play into the commander's intent that the head coach has? And then the sub-objectives that he sets out for each unit, each group, each individual member of the squad. And that's no different than in an individual competition. What are you trying to achieve? Which data sets may help, if you can improve a number to show that you're getting closer to that goal. And again, if you don't have the expertise or the skill set to start making this working backwards from the game logical progression, just find an experienced coach who'll be able to look, more holistically at your sleep, at your mobility, at your nutrition, and might be able to give you that level of context in a way that you might not be qualified to do yourself.
Yeah, and it's funny because it depends, and context are often not satisfying, but I don't know how else you would answer the question. And it's interesting to me. So like you're talking about commander's intent and working backwards from whatever problem it is you're trying to solve. So it seems like what you're saying is, to figure out what data you're going to use or collect, you have to have asked relevant questions. So, and I think when it comes to this data movement, there's two ways that people look at it. There's, I think, the school of thought that you're espousing, which is we need to have the right questions before we can start collecting the right data. And I think the other way of looking at it is, well, we're just going to collect a bunch of data to help us generate the right questions. I think that the latter way of looking at it can be problematic, because if you don't know what questions to ask, where does the data collection end? There's no boundaries. It's almost like it's so overwhelming. So am I correct in sort of in summarizing that you guys think you have to have the right questions before you can collect the right data?
Yes, because there is no good answer to a bad question.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So versus going on this fishing expedition and saying, well, we're not really sure what we want to measure, so we're just going to collect a bunch of stuff and then hope that the numbers kind of magically spark this insight.
Yes.
Okay.
And we can't assume that what the device makers are feeding us in their ad campaigns or on their product spec sheet or on their website is the correct set of data. So, for example, I've seen, recently tennis rackets with sensors embedded in them, and basketballs, that will talk about ball rotation, speed, trajectory, this kind of thing. And really, I think the first time I heard about anything like this was this golf tracking vest that you claim to use like Israeli missile technology to track the trajectory of the ball. But, I forget whether it made it into the book, which is bad of me, isn't it? That's very bad short-term memory. But maybe I'm collecting too much data. It could be messed me up. But anyway, silliness aside, if somebody, say a tennis player, was using this in quotes smart or intelligent tennis racket, and it found that their average first serve speed had declined by, say, I don't know, 7.9 miles an hour, right? Like, this could be viewed as a problem. But the problem is that if the player and or their coach goes away and then starts to extrapolate that in a faulty manner and think, oh, my goodness, their arms aren't strong enough, we better have them do some more curls, or maybe if there's a shoulder problem there, we better work on that. Almost always such things get extrapolated physically, and that may be the wrong conclusion to draw. And because that device is not looking at the context. And so say it's Roger Federer, and I believe at Wimbledon he either didn't drop a set or only dropped one set this time, and his record-setting 8th win, believe it was. And so say that over the course of his tournament, just due to fatigue, that was the average, drop was 7.9 miles an hour. Well, the outcome was still precisely what he wanted, which is he executed his skills to the level that his opponent couldn't deal with them, right? And he not only won every match in straight sets or almost straight sets, but ended up winning the Wimbledon Championship yet again. And so this decline in first serve speed that we may have seen, and again, I'm just making up an example, is completely irrelevant. And yet, if you had invested all of your stock in whatever metrics this tennis racket manufacturer / whatever company they white labeled the sensor technology was trying to feed you, or the coach had been, we could have seen that decline as a fundamental performance problem and gone away and made changes, maybe having him do some stuff in the weight room between matches that actually led to detrimental performance in the next match and may have in fact impeded his progress in the tournament. And so again, we need to be very careful that we don't take one number just because a device manufacturer says it's good, or like HRV because it's become a hot topic, or even with GPS, where we saw rugby back in the day, every rugby team had to have GPS, and try to make one thing everything, because if you do, that can lead you down a pretty rocky path.
Yeah, and I think I remember hearing Andy give a talk where he said, data isn't the problem, or the information isn't the problem. It's like we're the problem. Human beings are the problem, because data is devoid of context. And as human beings, we decide what context is meaningful, and then we can apply that data within whatever framework or context we deem to be relevant. So I think the idea is that, human beings still have to think and kind of make decisions, and come back around to whatever the relevant context is. And I don't know if there's any way that we can get rid of the need to actually think. And so even when you collect data, you can't really get rid of the human element, because human beings decide, where the data is relevant within whatever context it is that you're looking at. So I don't know, is that kind of a good way to sort of summarize your stance on, when data is meaningful, and then how to strike this balance between collecting too much data or the wrong kind of data?
Yes. And I think that's where a coach comes in, because say that you're having marital problems if you're married, say that you just got fired from your job, okay? All of that's going to affect your HRV and is going to affect your overall performance and recovery, because much as we might like to, we cannot put different areas of our lives in little convenient boxes and expect them to not bleed over or influence the other. And much like in the body, so taking a single data point like HRV and trying to make it the final word on recovery and readiness is a fundamentally flawed premise. And again, there are no good answers to bad questions. And so really what we're advocating in the book is, despite, recently I saw an ad for, should we say, one of the leading, I don't want to get sued, but one of the leading wrist-based wearable device manufacturers touting their new product and it's personalized coaching that it offers. As you just said a moment ago, a wrist-borne device or a hearable, coach in your ear, these new bloody sunglasses that have the earbuds telling you to speed up or slow down based on a very limited number of data points. is never going to be a substitute for the eye of an experienced coach, like someone like Stu McMillan if you're a sprinter, or Steve Magnus if you're a distance runner, or, a Jim Harbaugh or someone like that. It's just, technology can be a useful tool in their toolbox, but it should be used to inform the asking of better questions, sometimes to cue and to calibrate and then recalibrate. But it should be but one tool in their arsenal, and we cannot replace true coaching expertise, true human coaching expertise, with anything that is available commercially in a device today, or probably even in the future, because you do need that human context. You do need even someone that's a skilled communicator and a skilled teacher. And I think that we've got so caught up in the hacking movement and this desire to create shortcuts that we've left master. We're running the risk of leaving mastery by the wayside, and that's that's a dangerous path to go down.
Yeah, I never thought about it in the way that you just described, but coaching is all about tinkering, and you're basically saying we can use data to make ourselves better tinkerers, but the tinkering must go on. There's no way to eliminate that trial and error and trying to solve problems in this very dynamic way. And one thing that I thought was really interesting about the book that most people don't touch on when they talk about technology and data is you guys really get into some serious ethical discussions. And the first area I want to talk about with you and hear your thoughts is with regard to privacy. So some of this technology is very intrusive. And if we're talking about like professional or even collegiate sport, for example, so a lot of teams are collecting data on players outside of work. For example, when they go to bed at night or during their personal time, and it's presumably to make them better. So they're effectively saying, we want you to wear this at night when you're away from outside of the supervision of the team, because it's to make you better, which I think is a little bit paternalistic, especially when, ironically enough, we can't say objectively that measuring or tracking how somebody sleeps with a wearable is going to improve their performance. We don't actually know that yet. So it's kind of a leap of faith, but we do know that it's intrusive. And if a player comes in, let's say, a player got in a fight with a spouse, or the kid was up late, or maybe the player was celebrating a birthday. It's like if the team looks at that wearable or whatever the wearable comes up with, and whatever it's the performance staff or the coach says, oh, you got a crappy night of sleep last night, like what happened? As if like the individual should always have to justify what he or she is doing on his or her off time. And then you brought up an example in the book of, I think it was like there's some corporations that are almost like demanding that their employees wear some of these things outside of work, which I guess companies are free to have whatever policies they want. I don't know why anybody would want to work for a company that's that intrusive, but these are issues that tend to not be addressed. People assume, oh, well, let's just collect and see what happens. But I think this is a very real and potentially tangible downside, as there are privacy issues associated with this. And to the point where if I was like an agent for a player or even advising a player, like I might say, I don't think that you should, allow these teams to track what you're doing outside of work, because as we'll talk about later, that could be used against you potentially. So how did you guys go about, or where do you even begin to ask some of these privacy questions? I know that we're not going to solve the problem. It's way too philosophical and abstract, but what are the right questions we need to be asking when it comes to privacy and some of these wearables?
Yeah, and I'll credit, Brian and Andy had some great insight on this, but and you and I went back and forth about it a bit offline as well. But really, Dr. Kelly Starrett was the one that pushed us to include this section as being absolutely vital. And there's so many different ways that we could approach this, aren't there? One is that there are these independent think tanks in DC, and imagine that, nonpartisanship. Does that even exist? Well, apparently it does, supposedly. And one of them put out a very large and long-term research paper about the current state of technology and personal technology and where it's going. And their belief is that the next generation of fitness devices is going to feature personalized advertising, which if you've ever downloaded an ad blocker because you're sick of these ads intruding on your time when you're online, or even if you haven't and you're just frustrated by that online, well, get ready, because these ads are going to be following you around. And there's even been some suggestion that if you want to opt out of that, and I believe maybe there are some e-readers that do this, where if you want to pay for an ad-free version, you have to pay a premium of, say, $50 or $75 or maybe even $100 to opt out of that. And so it's there's a reason I use the Evernote Clearly app when I'm reading feature stories, because it kind of changes what's on the page and just cuts out all the extraneous crap that I don't want to see on the sidebars and just shows you the story, and then you can highlight that and save it to Evernote. So that's one example of technology being useful. But imagine how frustrating this is going to be, maybe out on a run or maybe finished with a run, and you're going to get personalized ads. And because some of these devices now know which activity you're doing, or sometimes they prompt you to select an activity, you're going to start, if you run a lot, you're going to be starting to get ads for running shoes. But where it starts to get a little crazy and a little big brother is not even that, but this think tank claimed in their research paper that they believe that that's going to then evolve to some of these companies selling your data to pharmaceutical companies. And so it's going to know if you have some cardiovascular health problem. Well, guess what? Just like in the magazines that you read, you're going to start getting ads for blood pressure drugs or some kind of heart drugs and this kind of thing. And it's really the Wild West right now. And to their credit, I believe it's Fitbit that has, and again, I don't want to get sued, so I'll try to speak carefully, but on their website, a disclaimer that says, we do not sell your data to third parties. And if that's true and they're sticking to that, well, thumbs up to them. But I wish that if it is that company or another that's doing this, that they would get together with Apple, with Samsung, with Garmin, with all the others, and that they would form some kind of charter to sign that would give you as the consumer the peace of mind to know that this doomsday scenario that the think tank came up with will actually not happen. Because if that is happening, it's what the analysts, the tech analysts, Gartner and Forrester and the like, call a virtuous cycle revenue model. And in the consumer space, what that would mean is that you are paying for this device up front, and then they would also be profiting from selling the data that such a device is collecting on the back end. And so it's virtuous to them because they're getting paid on multiple points of this circle that just keeps going round and round. And so I think that there needs to be some level of self-policing within the tech community, because I'm not a big fan of, I'm pretty politically centrist, but so I'm not even saying there needs to be mandatory government or state, federal or state regulation on this. But I think that if the tech companies were truly in this for the right reasons to improve people's health, one, they would make it readily available to you, all of the data they've ever collected. And what they would do there is they would mirror educational legislation such as FERPA, where if you demand your transcript from a college or university, they have a certain amount of time to provide that full transcript to you. And then also in the healthcare IT world, we see, in, say, electronic forms, electronic patient signature capture, that you have to sign a new HIPAA agreement every year. And while it might seem annoying, if you go to the hospital one year with one kid because they broke an arm, and the next year your other kid breaks a leg, and you have, oh gosh, you've got to sign these bloody forms and put in the same info again. It is a little redundant, but yet there are checks and balances there, both at the state and the federal level. And there are also, with your health records, if you demand those, most states have a statute where they have to produce that entire medical record within, say, 24 to 72 hours. And this is overseen by regulators. What regulators are overseeing this fitness technology, or just technology in general, from your smartphone or your smartwatch? And I use the term lightly. Who is overseeing that right now? And I think the answer to my knowledge is nobody. And so if we don't want to get government involved, and I understand the reluctance to do so, then the device manufacturers need to step up and need to say, okay, enough of this. We really are out to collect data simply to improve the algorithm with a view to improving your health. And obviously, these are for-profit corporations, and they're certainly entitled to make a profit in a free market. But I think that they owe a debt to the user community to do a much better job of safeguarding our data. And they also, without us signing something when we buy a wearable, whether it's a smartwatch, it's an app for our phone, it's sunglasses with a little earbud, whatever it might be, they owe it to us to at least give us the option to sign some kind of disclaimer, whether that, probably digitally, just on your little screen, and for there to be some checks and balances, because right now there really aren't. And if this comes to pass, what this think tank, this kind of doomsday scenario they had, well, it's not just going to unleash a torrent of ads upon us everywhere we go, but they're going to be profiting from that as well. And I think that I can speak for Brian and Andy by saying that that's pretty messed up, and that can't happen. And they really, again, the device manufacturers should step up and agree to self-regulate based around some simple charter, even if it was 5 or 6 points that they would all sign. Yeah,
like you said, I don't know if the government necessarily has to be the body to regulate this stuff, but you brought up HIPAA, and when we talk about medical information, there is legal precedent for some of the privacy stuff that we're talking about. But I guess I wonder, like, maybe you're saying that there is no default when it comes to, like, who owns this data. I think you're suggesting that there's been no default statement as to say, okay, well, the data belongs to the people that it's being collected on, or the data belongs to the company. Because if we can't definitively say or legally say who the data belongs to, then it can end up in the wrong hands, like you said. I mean, and forget making money and advertisers. This data, if it gets in the wrong hands, because it's no one's regulating who controls it, it can get in the hands of health insurance companies who can use it to discriminate against people, or raise their premiums. If you're talking about, like, professional sports, it can be used by teams as leverage during contract negotiations. So is there any kind of default as to who we're saying owns the data, or do we really not know? Is it still the Wild West when it comes to that?
I think it is the Wild West. I think I did read something about the most recent NBA agreement, labor agreement, where there is something in there, some kind of stipulation, and they created a task force around tracking. And I think they've now approved, Whoop or one of these device manufacturers to do this, but I'm not sure if that stipulates who owns the data. So I'd have to look at that, talk to my buddy at FIBA and ask him if he knows, or if anyone at the NBA might know that, but maybe it's out there in the mass media. So yeah, I need to educate myself a bit better when it comes to pro sports teams. But yeah, you're right with regard to what you said about it potentially influencing contract negotiations, even if in a labor agreement between the players union and the owners union, if it said, well, we're not allowed to. The bottom line is you can't unknow what you know.
Exactly.
And so it may influence an owner or a head coach or a head scout or whatever it might be, similar to how it might in the workplace. If they're mandating some of these devices and device use in a corporate scenario, or, even sometimes this is incentivized, right? Like you can get rebates through your health insurer if you meet certain targets. And so, this is starting to seep into the corporate wellness in quotes. But again, in that scenario, who owns that data? Does the company own it? Does the health insurer who's providing the data in partnership with that company own it? Does the employee own it? And so, we start to get into a very murky pool right now that we can't really see the bottom of at this point. But I think, again, really, it's up to the consumer to start making some demands around this. And that will hopefully drive some of these equipment manufacturers to step up and do the necessary when it comes to at least asking permission to do certain things. And also, as I said, as I believe Fitbit does, and maybe several others, that they do say quite clearly on their website, we do not sell your data. We do not release this data paid or unpaid, to any third party. This is for our own purposes, to improve our algorithms for the good of your health and the good of your performance, in which case, well, thumbs up to them for being the first to do it.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating about the whole discussion is I'm very much an advocate for emergent markets, and we tend to associate emergent markets with individual liberty, but I think here's an instance where these emergent markets could potentially be very oppressive, even more oppressive than the government, if the data ends up in the hands of advertisers and people who have this commercial interest. So where the market is oppressing the individual. And then I think it's so tricky as to, if we call this wellness data, like I guess there's a distinction philosophically and legally between wellness data and medical data. If you call it medical data, then HIPAA, is a concern. If you call it wellness data, then it's not as regulated as medical data would be. But these wearables are tracking physiological data. So there's this very slippery slope between physiological data and medical data. I don't know when it ceases to be physiological and then it becomes medical. So these are really interesting questions. And like I said, we're not going to resolve it now, but I think just even having the conversation is very helpful. And then you also brought up in the book, let's assume, for example, that these companies are committed to privacy and ensuring that the data ends up in the right hands, or they're making a sort of a de facto statement and saying that the data belongs to the user of these technologies and it's not going to be distributed anywhere else. So assuming that privacy is good, there are still issues with encryption. And you mentioned in the book that a lot of these technologies aren't secure. So do you know, is there any kind of regulation demanding that they be secure, or is this still a concern?
No, I even saw something, I believe it was on the Daily Telegraph's website in the UK, about how easily wearables can be hacked, and for nefarious purposes. Well, I guess hacking is usually nefarious. That might be redundant, but you know what I'm saying. And so right now, as far as I'm aware, there isn't a standard. And again, in healthcare technology, there are certain regulatory standards. And say if a healthcare technology company like Cerner or Meditech or whoever it might be is collecting data in the medical record, and you would know more about this than I do, I'm sure, but they'll say, is it like SAS 70 or something like this? There's this regulatory standard for software as a service where basically they're storing your data not at the hospital but in an offsite data center, and they boast about having double or triple failover and redundant backup and this kind of thing, and often that's part of a hospital's disaster recovery plan or business continuity plan. And so say if it's in Florida and the hospital gets hit by a hurricane, well, they're not going to lose the data of 20 years worth of patients or however many years of records have been digitized. And they're also going to be able to continue to use, say, an e-forms and e-signature solution to register patients if the main systems go down and this kind of thing. So again, if we look to the medical industry, to your point, with medical data, it is very strongly protected, and there are very clear stipulations and requirements for that. Whereas right now, as far as I'm aware, there are no similar stipulations for fitness technology or personal devices in general.
Yeah, and I think that if you encrypt these technologies, they're going to be a lot less accessible because the price is going to go way up. I remember when I was in the military, you carry your inter-team radio, and then you have a separate GPS, and you've got a separate satellite phone. You've got all these different ways to communicate and navigate. And I always thought to myself, like, if they could just take an iPhone and encrypt it, it has all those features in one. You could have a navigation app in the iPhone. You could do your inter-team radio. They even have something where it's like you can text message in the military over a secure net. So if you can make every feature on the iPhone secure, it would have a lot of military application. But the problem is that would make the iPhone really, really expensive, even for the military. So if we're just talking about, tracking someone's heart rate or their distance when they're running, if you encrypted that technology, I don't think there'd be a market for any of this stuff. But obviously, we talked about some of these ethical issues. So it's really interesting how, like I said, I'm all for emergent markets, but I don't even know if people like who are pro market could have foreseen where some of this technology would take us and how murky some of these these market issues blur with health issues and privacy and stuff like that. So it's really unique times and very fascinating. And it's good. I mean, I'm glad that you guys helped to initiate the conversation in your book, because I think that when you're only hearing about what these technologies can offer from the vendor, they tend to neglect this aspect of it and withhold some of the broader issues that these things bring to light. So I want to transition a little bit into, you guys talk about the concept of always being reachable, and these technologies, whether it's our phones or social media, they've made the world more connected, which in a lot of ways is a good thing, but they've also made us way more accessible, sometimes to the point where it can be very irritating. And I feel like personally, I don't even get to spend enough time with my immediate family and my loved ones, and I could be at home at 10 o'clock on a weeknight, and somebody that I don't know that well, because I'm accessible, can send me a text message, and my phone vibrates when I'm trying to have a conversation with my wife or a family member, and I guess I can ignore it, or I can put my phone on airplane mode or shut it off. But there's really kind of like with the technologies, as far as the privacy issues go, there's no regulation or no rules or no etiquette, and we don't really have any etiquette for, okay, when should we feel like people should always respond to us, within seconds, because we're so reachable. I think sometimes we forget that we're not that important. So I guess my question is, if we were to do like a Seinfeld episode about what is good, tech etiquette when it comes to trying to communicate with people, I think that we have to draw some boundaries. Emailing people isn't as intrusive as sending a text message. So I guess, I don't know, how do you think we should go about answering that as far as what is some good communication etiquette when we live in a world where we're perhaps overly reachable?
Yeah, I think, my gosh, I could just ramble for an hour on this, but I'll try not to. It was funny when you talked about at 10 o'clock, talking to your wife. Well, at 10 o'clock your time, we started this interview, and you're wasting your time hearing me ramble on instead, right? But yeah, exactly. But on the flip side, I reached out to you via your website to initiate a conversation, which led to this conversation. And so, the tech isn't all bad, I guess. I think it was the same when you interviewed Andy as well. So, yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? And I think that for anyone that's read Unplugged, there's a gentleman by the name of Dr. Frank Merritt down in Florida. Not that I want to shamelessly plug other projects, but just allow me to for about 2 seconds. So we have a book which just came up for pre-order called The 17-Hour Fast, which comes out in March. And it's not a fasting book, okay? There is some information around fasting in it, but it is a boundaries book. Much like Unplugged is not a book about fitness technology, it is a book about boundaries, and it is a book about asking the right questions at the right time. And one of the things that Frank talks about in there is using this 17-hour fast, which typically you would start, you would have a normal dinner, say from 6 to 7 p.m. the night before, and you would fast from food until noon the next day. And we talk about using this as an on-ramp to make some changes in your life. And one of them is to do a brief technology fast at the same time as you are fasting from food. And so we're not trying to go too far down this nefarious behavior modification route, but really just making the point that not only do we need to reset our relationship with food, which has, for a lot of people got out of hand for a long time now. And you talk about the immediacy. So the immediacy of not just the microwave and being able to store large quantity of food in our refrigerator. And if you start to track some of the obesity stats against such developments, but then also having 24-hour access to grocery stores and drive-thrus and this kind of thing. Now, that isn't a problem if you are able to set boundaries and go into a little Charles Duhigg and the power of habit and create positive habit loops. But for some people, overeating obviously becomes a very powerful habit, and also a reward mechanism, or comfort eating if you're sad or depressed. And I think this is that we start to get into what this does in the brain with triggering the release of dopamine and other pleasure related chemicals. And we see this with technology. And actually what Adam Alter, your good friend and somebody whose work has really inspired us in his book Irresistible and others, talks about is it's not actually they're getting the likes or the shares or the comments on whatever social site or the emails, whatever it might be, or a text message reply from your buddy that gives us that squirt. But it's the anticipation of it that gives us that squirt of dopamine and these other chemicals. And that reinforces a habit loop. And so really, then to tie that into Charles Duhigg's work again, he says you can't just eliminate a habit. You've got to replace it with another habit. And so, you know, whether it's in Unplugged or the 17-hour fast, what we're really trying to do is have people more honestly appraise their own either technology use or how they use food as a reward system in their life, and what potential consequences that might have. And then really, as we mentioned earlier, just start to draw some better boundaries. And again, you mentioned etiquette. Well, I think, again, context is very important, because back in the day, there were a class of people, yourself included probably, who were emergency responders or soldiers who needed to carry around pagers to be notified because they had to be called into action. But yet now we're all carrying the equivalent of a pager.
Right. And
if we're tracking our sleep with a phone app or whatever it might be, this thing may be on us 24 hours a day. And again, to go back to Adam Alter, I think he asked a very simple question early on in Irresistible. And it's just simply, how far away is your phone right now as you're reading this page?
Yeah.
Well, it's a very simple question, but that simple question can yield a heck of an answer. And he also goes to make the point that we're looking at our phone on average every 6.5 minutes. Well, then what if you have a wearable on your wrist 24/7 as well? What does that look like in the average time that you're either looking at your phone, looking at your wearable, or both? And then what about your work computer or laptop? What about your iPad that you use for entertainment or, again, to check emails? And, you know, a lot of people talk about work-life balance. A lot of companies push this, but yet they expect their employees to be contactable virtually 24/7 and reply to instant messages, texts, or emails, or they're not being, in quotes, responsive. And so we pay lip service to these things, but really, whether it be in a corporate setting or for athletes or just everyday folks, I think a lot of us, myself included, are failing to practice what we preach, and it's a problem. And we need to look to the work of Alter and Charles Duhigg and Carl Honore, who wrote In Praise of Slowness. We've got to slow the heck down. We've got to be less reactive and less responsive. We've got to be more deliberate. You know, I guess Essentialism is another great book, you know, McKeown's book. And but it's all very well to read these things, but unless there's adherence, unless they make us take action, then, you know, we're just reading a lot of self-help books and it's not doing us any good.
Yeah, and it's tricky because I've been guilty of it myself, where we all think that our problems or our needs are the most important, and we all have these little boxes that we have to check and items to cross off our list, and it's like, oh, I've got to ask so-and-so about something. Well, it's 11 o'clock right now. I'll just shoot him a text, because now the burden isn't on me to complete whatever task I have to complete. Now it's in somebody else's hand. But I try to stop myself and say, like, okay, this is not that important that I should be bothering this person at 11 p.m., even if he or she chooses to ignore it. And you brought up Adam. I think there's kind of individual behaviors that we have to change, but it's also kind of a systemic issue. And even if you're talking about a company, like a leadership issue, because Adam mentioned in his book I guess there's one company somewhere, I think it was a European company, where they legitimately like shut off people's emails when they go on vacation so they're not reachable. Because if you don't clearly define what the expectations are, people are going to say, well, you know, I know that I'm on vacation, but if I don't check my email all the time, it's going to be held against me. And I think that it creates this martyr syndrome where people feel like they always have to be reachable because, you know, the boss says, wink, wink, you're on vacation, but we're not sure if the boss really means it. So let's always be reachable. Whereas you can get rid of that ambiguity as a boss if you say, I'm literally going to deactivate your email while you're on vacation, and it's going to send an automatic response that says, you know, I'm out of the office. If you have any pressing issues, you know, refer to so-and-so. And in the meantime, I'm not going to read any email that you send me between now and whenever I get back. So if you have something that you need to say, rewrite this email in a week. Like, that's how you get rid of some of that stuff. You make the expectations very clear. But if you're that boss, and sometimes it's easier to just say, well, I really need to get this done. I'm going to bother this person on vacation. But it gets rid of those boundaries where now we can never rest, right? Because we're always reachable. So it's, I think there's a lot of ways to attack it on kind of a micro and a macro level, but we're all responsible. And I think that we need to demand more from ourselves and from each other when it comes to that.
For sure. Yeah, and I think it was my friend Pete Hitzman, who's people may know is one of the editors at Breaking Muscle. Him and Shane Trotter do a great job over there. And it's some bro science free writing, which is good. Those guys, and then my friend Ian McMahon as well for Sports Illustrated, and The Guardian does a really great job with this stuff as well. And I think that Pete told me about this app called Rescue Time. And you may say to me, how long do you think you spend on social media every day? And I tell you, I don't know, 30 minutes or an hour or whatever self-deceiving answer I may give you. But if I run Rescue Time, I may see it's 2.25 hours on average over a week or a month. And then you can use an app like that. And there are multiple others out there to then do exactly what you said. Either it can be based on time of day, or it can be based on total number of hours. So say I say, okay, I want to limit my social use to 10 minutes a day or 30 minutes a day, whatever it might be, that I can set that up. And the second I go over it, click, bang, it's gone for the rest for 24 hours until the next day starts, whatever you define. Maybe it's 1 minute past midnight, maybe it's 7 a.m. I don't know, depending on what your day looks like and whether you work shifts or regular hours or what have you. And so technology in this case can be very useful in, moderating technology, I guess. And so that might seem kind of redundant to use tech to moderate tech, but I think there are these tools, and you mentioned personal responsibility, and I think that that's huge because sure, your CEO or your department manager may mandate something to you, but if you were really enterprising, you could probably find a way around it, if you were that hooked on it, like any kind of addict would. Whereas if you become part of your own solution and own that, I think you're probably far more likely to change your habits for the better in doing so. And even last night, for an example, now I'm terrible with doing this, but a couple of nights recently, I've got to where I've worked really hard during the day, and even though I like to write at night, that can start to lapse into workaholism. And so he says, as we're doing this podcast interview at night, and so I decided I'm just going to leave my little Microsoft Surface tablet that I used to write on switched off and in my backpack, and I'm also going to switch off my phone until tomorrow. Now, there was a problem where I couldn't remember if another podcast I have, which is actually tomorrow morning, was tomorrow morning, or if it was this morning. And so I said to my wife, do you still have access to my calendar on your phone? Because full disclosure, we shared a phone until last year, so I didn't get my own phone until I was 36.
Good for you.
And I kind of wish I hadn't. Kind of wish we still shared a phone. But anyway, and so there was this comical dance. Well, I thought you said you were shutting this off, and I just smacked myself upside the head about it. But finally got the answer I needed and was able to re-shut it down. But even in that 10, 15 second window of realizing, okay, my personal Gmail calendar is still connected to my wife's phone, but my work one was not. And so I guess I should probably sync those. It's my own fault. But I had to fire up my device. And then the temptation is there. Oh, did so-and-so reply to my email? Did you maybe email me to reschedule this podcast? And then you start checking Instagram or Twitter. And An hour and 10 minutes later, you emerge bleary-eyed. And then you try to go to sleep and fail because of all the blue light. So, it is about setting boundaries. But again, going back to Pete's suggestion with Rescue Time, if we recognize our tendency to look at things and look at ourselves, particularly through rose-tinted spectacles, we can either use other people to speak truth into our life or use an app like Rescue Time to give yourself real answers about your tech use and then to set real defined, uncrossable boundary lines to help us modify our habits for the better.
Yeah, and I used one of those trackers after I read Adam's book, and I was ashamed of myself when I learned how much time, because we can always rationalize we're doing it for work, but I know that a lot of the time that I spend on social media it's not for work. It's just kind of, I'm just wasting time on there. And so some of these apps can can control when you're able to go on. So if you say like, okay, I don't want to be able to go on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter after 10 p.m., if you try to go on after 10 p.m., they basically like you have to go back to the site, reconfigure all it basically won't let you do it. And it kind of like shames you and makes you feel like a piece of garbage if you try to go on during that time. So I think a key takeaway from what these technologies do that allow some discipline on social media or with technology is they take the onus of responsibility for discipline off the individual, because if you're relying on discipline often fails people. Whereas if you just create an environment that literally does not allow you to do whatever it is that you're trying to avoid, then you're not reliant upon discipline, because there's always a way to rationalize and find that hole in your discipline. But if you can just create an environment that doesn't let you do the things that you think are possibly self-destructive. So it's like with food, if you have the wrong food in your house or in your refrigerator, you have to rely on discipline to not eat it. Whereas if you just don't have it to begin with, you can't do it. So that's how I think some of these technologies work, and they are very useful, because we're always going to try to find a way to rationalize and do this stuff when we shouldn't be doing it, and then we become so disconnected from the world in front of us, and we just become, as Adam would say, these email zombies, where we're like, I wonder if so and so responded to my email. But switching gears now, because you didn't talk about virtual technology too much in the book, but that's coming, right? So where do you see virtual reality technology making things better or worse? I mean, in like 10 years, are people still going to be doing things like surfing and having sex with other humans, or are we just going to be wearing glasses and living in the virtual world? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, one good use for it is my co-author Brian McKenzie has collaborated with Dr. Andrew Huberman, who is a neuroscientist at Stanford. And the Huberman Lab is also known in the community as the Fear Lab. And they went down and shark dived in Mexico and shot 360 video. They shot some terrifying spider footage. They shot some footage which will simulate you being stuck on a tree branch 100 feet in the air and of attack dogs grabbing your arm. And really, they're doing this for Brian's purposes to correlate your physical, cognitive, and emotional state with your breathing pattern, and how to then modulate that through various kinds of breathing. And then Andrew also and his team also measure quite a few other data points with this. And so that's one constructive use I can see with all this, with virtual reality. And even Andy offers the example in the book, what if for trainers, if you were able to simulate more accurately sparring, for example, from an MMA fighter or a boxer, and reduce the number of blows to the head. And we're not there with the technology yet, but there are some folks who are starting to explore this. So like anything else, the technology is neutral. It's just a question of how we wield it, and then what boundary fences we put around it, I suppose. But there's some definitely some good uses. But then I see these, the phone manufacturers trying to give away VR goggles if you buy their latest flagship phone for $950 or whatever it is these days. And I just think you look like a dork. I'm sorry, like they're trying to make these guys and girls in the ads look cool. You're just a nerd. Like, it just drives me nuts. And it also, it drives me crazy now, where there's a little movie that I like that isn't super critically acclaimed and maybe, isn't a classic, but it's called In Good Company with Topher Grace and Dennis Quaid. And there's a part in it where this tech guy comes in and buys out, what the equivalent, I think in the movie it's called Sports America, the equivalent of Sports Illustrated. And this guy, the guy that takes it over, this tech guy who talks about synergy a lot and even does the synergy hands, like a left hand and a right hand held out apart, and what we're trying to get to is this linking of hands, and that's their cheesy logo. But it's he brings up this thing at an all company meeting, they take over basically SI, and he talks about, having a section on computers in the magazine, and Dennis Quaid, being the old school head of ad sales, laughs at him and risks losing his job by really speaking up in this meeting and saying, computer section in the magazine, are you serious? Like, who's going to want to read that? Well, there are a couple of well-known, nationally distributed sports magazines that now regularly have features on e-gaming in them.
Yeah.
And I don't want to read that. And so I skip through it, and I really think, is it really worth this 6 pages of content plus the 3 ads that you put in the middle of it? There's so 9 pages, because obviously they're doing an ad buy around technology in it. And what Dennis Quaid spoke about in this movie that's probably 15 years old has actually come to pass. E-gaming is not sports. Okay, it isn't, and it never will be. And so I don't know what the crap it's doing in this magazine, and it makes me think about whether I'm going to resubscribe. And I'm a magazine junkie, so I probably will, and I still like that, having that tangible hard copy in my hand, much like with hardback books. But yeah, I mean, really, it's quite astonishing to me. The first time I saw this was probably 18 months ago, and I just thought, good on you, Dennis Quaid, or whatever his character name was in the movie, because you saw this coming and you called it out for the BS that it truly is, and yet it's still come to pass.
The esports thing is not going away either. I mean, some of these organizations, I think, because it's projected to be like a multi-billion-dollar industry at some point, they're hiring like performance teams to help consult, like strength and conditioning coaches and sleep experts, because, as crazy as it sounds, these gamers are like pushing their physiology, because to win some of these tournaments, you have to stay up for like 72 hours playing video games. They're trying to figure out, like, are these guys going to be on performance enhancing drugs to stay awake and maintain their cognitive, focus when they're playing these games where they're sleep deprived? And then how can they, when they're not gaming, like build up their fitness so they can withstand the stress of their, multi-day gaming adventures? So it's like, it's crazy. What's the boundary now between like an e-sport and a real sport? Because the industry is looking at it like it's a real sport, and they're treating, they're trying to like maximize the physiology of these athletes, as they call them, so they can stay up for 72 hours in game.
Here is the worst one, and if it precludes me forever writing for this magazine, then so be it. But if they're listening, you should be ashamed of yourselves. So I think if I sent this thing, clipped it, and sent it to Kelly Starrett or anyone else, Sue Falsone, or anyone who's in that kind of industry, I think they would have a heart attack. And it was a few top 5 mobility exercises for e-gaming, and you probably know the magazine I'm talking about. And I about drowned in my bathtub. TMI that I was reading this in the bath, but I was, and I wanted to drown myself because it's just so horrific. Like, trying to improve your wrist flexion and dorsiflexion so you can recover from the stresses of e-gaming. What have we come to? I mean, honestly.
No, I have a friend in the field who he's kind of like an instigator, and whenever he comes across one of these esports things, he always tags me on it because he knows that I get kind of a kick out of it. But yeah, it's. I mean, I think sometimes we take ourselves way too seriously, but when there's money involved, that tends to happen. And I mean, the fact that there's a market for this kind of stuff and it's potentially multi-billion dollars. I mean, what does that say about us? But hey, it's like it's who we are. So we can't really say anything because we get what we ask for.
I'm hoping that there'll be a backlash where. Vinyl made a comeback. I think vinyl sold more than CDs last year, and the power readers that I know, 95% of them are still gung-ho about having a nice hardback. And if you look at a book like Jocko Willink's Discipline Equals Freedom, and the unique design of that, and really what we tried to do in Unplugged, again, having full color photos of everyone from my kids, to make it clear that this is, this isn't an elite book, to Kai Lenny and Leif Whitaker and Laird Hamilton, doing big wave and big mountain stuff. And I think that there are still people that there's always a backlash that want that tangibility. And my wife said earlier on, what if paper books go away? What are you going to do? And I said, well, I hope if publishers start to either make them prohibitively expensive or there's some other move toward digital only, that there will be a backlash like there has been with vinyl. And there are things about vinyl, whether it's the liner notes or the intentionality of putting on a record and listening to the whole side of it in the order that the artist wanted presented, which obviously iTunes broke the mold of that, and you can just select the songs you want now. But there is some thought, I think, from the artist and from the producer into what order the tracks go on an album. Yeah, I mean, I hope we never get to the stage of a la carte ebooks where you can just think, oh, I just want chapter 2 and I can buy that for 99 cents. I mean, hopefully I'm not giving anyone an idea here, but if that happens, I mean, it's going to be the book apocalypse maybe. But yeah, I hope that there's enough people that are going to still want to not be analog for analog's sake necessarily, but just recognize that, okay, you know, there's a time and place for ebooks. Maybe if you're doing research and you want to do a full content search, which is better than the physical index, great, go for it. I've done that a few times, you know, with a few books. But when it comes to reading for pleasure, there is no way in heck you'll have to prize that hardback from my dead lifeless fingers, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and you brought up like the elite thing. I think, you know, one of the negative things associated with this technology movement is that they've kind of like pathologized normal life, where it's like, if you look at where we are now as a species, I mean, we've solved for the most part the most pressing problems, you know, from like a survival standpoint. I mean, this is all kind of minutia, but it's so, I mean, even simple day-to-day activities, it's like, well, if you're not collecting data on it, how do you know if you're doing it right? And we've made things just so overly sophisticated where it's either, you know, if you're not tracking things, then you're gonna fall apart and be this fragile little flower because you don't have all the information about yourself. And similarly, it's like the whole idea where everybody has to be elite, where if you're not tracking all this stuff, how are you going to be a top performer? It's like, who says that everybody's got to be a top performer? I mean, like, you've probably been exposed to even elite athletes where, from like a training standpoint, some of them are really good at their sport, but they don't have elite training history. They don't have elite nutrition habits. So, like, do they even need some of this stuff? So it's like the fact that like everyone now is like either sick or has to be an elite athlete, and the only way to be like kind of, you know, not totally pathological is to just measure everything you do. And for most of, you know, human existence, like, we've managed to solve some pretty pressing problems without having to quantify everything. So going back to your original point, it's like, let's ask the right questions and figure out what we actually need to quantify that's going to solve a meaningful goal versus just measuring things out of fear. It's a lot of it's fear mongering, where if you don't measure, you're not going to be elite, or, you know, you're going to be sick. And I think that can be very self-serving to perpetuate that kind of fragility and say the solution is to measure everything, you know?
Yeah, and I think Stephen Kotler made the point where we interviewed him in the book. And for those who don't know, him and Jamie Wheel co-authored the book Stealing Fire, which is wonderful. And Stephen, of course, has numerous New York Times bestsellers, including The Rise of Superman, which is one of my favorite books of all time. And Stephen and Jamie work with the elite of the elite, whether that's special ops units, or it's innovators in the tech community, or it's the kind of elite athletes that Stephen profiled in Rise of Superman. And to my knowledge, I would need to go back and reread it, and I keep giving my copy away to people, but I don't think that he mentions using technology to slam you into a flow state in any way, shape, or form in Rise of Superman. And I also think that we need to get to the other side of complexity and find the simplicity that lies on the other side. And what I mean by that is, you see some of these elite athletes that are quantifying a lot of stuff, and yet if they go to work with Brian McKenzie, he finds that their breathing patterns are extremely dysfunctional, that often they're stuck in a state of stress breathing during the day, that they are chasing their breath during training, and that it's one of these areas where they've succeeded in spite of themselves. Or Kelly Starrett is another example where an athlete is elite despite missing 30% of their hip flexion. Well, if he's able to even give them half of that back, that's a 15% gain in efficiency versus the 2 or 3% that certain shoe manufacturers are claiming with their shoes that they hope are going to get someone to run a 2-hour marathon, which, you know, despite the fact that they have these special shoes and they, you know, basically race them on a Formula One track, and they had guys running ahead of them to try to create a certain effect of shielding them from the wind, the guys still weren't able to break the record. And I think if we go back to Roger Bannister, who was crazy busy in training for his 4-hour marathon attempt, and people revisit that story, or if you look at the British journalist Richard Asquith's book on Zatopek, arguably one of the greatest distance runners of all time, who not only did the Mo Farah double, but in his first ever attempt at the marathon distance also won the marathon. I think it was at the 52 Olympics. And his idea of monitoring his training was to go out into the forest and say, okay, that tree over there is about 150, 200 meters. That's going to be my short intervals for today. That tree that's a bit further along is probably 350, 400. That's going to be my long intervals. I'm going to do X number of short ones. I'm going to take a little break. I'm going to do X number of long ones. And when I feel the quality start to decline, I'm done for the day. He wasn't even using a stopwatch to time himself, and yet was able to win the 5K, the 10K, and the marathon at the Olympic level. And, just we all have that. You don't have to be Zatopek to be able to do that, to have those kind of instincts. You've just got to be in tune enough to be able to listen to yourself a bit more. And you've also got to start to look at, instead of obsessing over these, what we view as potential little speed bumps with marginal gains that we think we're going to make through technology. Let's start, trying to avoid or dig ourselves out of the major sinkholes with regard to mobility, with regard to breathing, with regard to sleep, nutrition, hydration, recovery. And then once we've made the majors, and, optimize as best we can there, then we can start to look at the minors and the marginal gains, but only then.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think you can appreciate the complexity of a system without overcomplicating the system. And like you mentioned, even at the elite level, there's often a lot of low-hanging fruit that will yield the biggest return on investment without having to make things overly complicated. And you mentioned, if you have like a multi-directional field sport athlete who, is missing, a bunch of hip flexion and hip internal rotation, like just getting them back to even what's considered normal, forget like for an athlete, but for a regular person, could yield, a huge change in performance. And it didn't require anything that sophisticated, just like kind of, trying to look for the obvious. I think sometimes we can look for that needle in the haystack, like you said, and we can major in the minors. Now, you've written quite a few books in this field among a variety of topics. What's next for you? I mean, you've really tackled a pretty difficult project with Unplugged. I'm curious to hear about what you've got on your plate next.
Yeah, and so I mentioned in my moment of shameless self-plugging the 17-hour fast. So yeah, that one, as I said, comes out in March. And then Brian and I are working on a secret project, which I can't really talk about right now, which is not to sound like I'm trying to be Jason Bourne, but we just need to keep it under wraps. So yeah, again, just somebody that I want to do more with because of the quality of the human being he is and how well we work together. And Kelly Starrett and I have two full books, Waterman 2.0, which is basically ready to run for anyone who's into water sports, which basically explores if you're going to be a water sports athlete at any level, these are some basic human competencies that you should have and some standards that you can hit. And if you can't, here are some mobilizations and some techniques to help you. And then another one called Flight Plan, which is really taking a more holistic view at air travel and how to fly better and not just survive that perfect storm of the toxic air environment, being crammed into an unergonomic seat, the jet lag and all of that, coming up with a 12-step protocol. And then we interview, Jocko Willink in that. We interview the bobsled Olympian Kelly Humphreys, Dave Asprey, a whole lot of smart folks, and get some of their tips and tricks as well. So we're hoping both of those will be out in 2018. And so, really just looking to continue challenging myself to learn more from these people that know a heck of a lot more about their field than I do, and really just have kind of a servant mentality with them where I provide the service of getting these great ideas out of their head and what they talk about on podcasts like this and getting it onto the page so that we can help the maximum number of people possible, not only improve their performance, but improve their life as well. Yeah, you do such a great job of taking some of these complex topics and making them more digestible. So it's a gift, and I don't know how you have the time to do all this stuff, but where can people learn more about you and kind of keep track of your newer projects when they're going to be released? Sure. So I only just got this website, so forgive it for being not very fully fleshed out, but philwhitebooks.com is the website, and then most of the main social sites /Phil White Books. And yeah, I mean, just I'd love to start a conversation with anyone anywhere about anything, really. I mean, really, it kind of comes down to the 3 C's model with me. You know, I think curiosity, which then drives conversations, which then leads to copywriting. So that's kind of my approach. And yeah, really grateful for you taking time out of your evening to talk to me about this. And yeah, would love to chat about any of this stuff with anyone, really. So yeah, reach out and let's have a conversation.
Yeah, well, you've been so generous with your time, Phil, and I'm sure this won't be the last time we have a conversation like this with all the work you're going to be doing in the future. So looking forward to chatting again soon. Thanks so much for your time.
Well, thank you so much. Really do appreciate it.